Most people would overlook a taped-up cardboard box sitting on a marble table surrounded by crystal champagne flutes. But my in-laws pointed and laughed, asking my father if he had pulled it out of the recycling bin. They had no idea that inside that 70-cent package was the legal deed to their entire existence. By the time they stopped giggling, I already owned everything they had. My name is Clara Harmon, and I was currently standing in the center of a living room that cost more than the entire neighborhood I grew up in. The Whitfield Lake Estate was a sprawling architectural marvel of glass and steel, perched aggressively on the shoreline as if daring the water to rise. Inside, the air smelled of imported pine candles and the specific, crisp scent of money. It was the annual holiday gathering, a mandatory summon for anyone bearing the Whitfield surname, or, in my case, married into it. The dining room table was a vast expanse of white Carrara marble, currently groaning under the weight of crystal stemware, platinum-rimmed porcelain, and floral arrangements that likely cost $3,000 apiece. Around me, the guests mingled with the practiced ease of people who had never had to worry about an overdraft fee in their lives. They were a collection of local dignitaries, business partners, and distant cousins who treated these events less like family reunions and more like networking opportunities. They wore their wealth like armor. The women were clad in silk and velvet, their jewelry catching the recessed lighting, while the men stood in clusters, swirling amber liquid in heavy glasses, laughing at jokes that were not funny, but were told by powerful men. And then there was my father. Carl Harmon stood near the edge of the room, looking as though he had been teleported from a different planet entirely. He was clutching a small, brown cardboard box against his chest with both hands. It was the kind of box you might find in the back of a closet, repurposed from a shipment of spark plugs or oil filters. It was sealed not with satin ribbon or gold foil, but with gray, industrial-grade duct tape. My heart ached with a fierce, protective rhythm as I looked at him. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal synthetic blend he had bought at a department store sale 10 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but the cut was boxy, the fabric a little too shiny under the unforgiving halogen lights. His hands, even scrubbed raw, still bore the permanent, faint maps of grease and oil in the deep lines of his skin, the hands of a man who had spent 40 years fixing the engines that people like the Whitfields drove without a second thought. He looked terrified. He looked small. I took a sip of my sparkling water, my eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. Though I kept my face smooth and pleasant, I saw them before they saw me watching. Lorraine Whitfield, my mother-in-law, was leaning against the granite kitchen island, a glass of champagne dangling precariously from her fingers. She was whispering something to Brooke, my sister-in-law, Brooke, whose only job title was socialite, and who treated her Instagram following like a religion, tilted her head back. They both looked at my father. Lorraine covered her mouth with a manicured hand, but the gesture did nothing to hide the crinkling of her eyes or the shaking of her shoulders. They were laughing. They were laughing at his suit. They were laughing at his posture. But mostly, they were laughing at that damned cardboard box. I felt a hand on my lower back. It was Noah, my husband. He gave me a gentle squeeze, a silent plea for patience. I looked up at him. He had the Whitfield jawline and the expensive haircut, but his eyes were anxious. He knew what was happening. He saw his mother and sister snickering, but he said nothing. He just stood there, anchoring me to the floor, hoping the storm would pass without him having to get wet. In the past, that silence might have comforted me, a shared endurance of his family's toxicity. Today, it felt like complicity. I realized with a jolt that I no longer knew which side of the line he truly stood on. "Well, look at this," a booming voice cut through the ambient chatter. The room quieted as Richard Whitfield, the patriarch and CEO of Whitfield Ridge Holdings, strode toward my father. Richard was a large man who took up space as if it were his birthright. He wore a velvet smoking jacket that probably cost more than my father's car. He stopped in front of Carl, towering over him, a shark-like grin plastered on his face. "Carl, good to see you," Richard said. His voice projected just loudly enough for the back of the room to hear. "I see you brought..." Something. My father straightened his spine, a reflex from his days on the factory floor. It is just a little something for you and Lorraine, for the anniversary, and the holiday. Richard took the box. He held it up by one corner, as if it were contaminated. The gray duct tape reflected the light dully. On the top, written in black permanent marker in my father's distinctively blocky, unrefined handwriting, were the words, "For Richard and Lorraine." "Charming," Richard said, turning the box around so the guests could get a good look. "You know, there are people who say gift wrapping is a dying art. I guess some people still believe in the raw, industrial aesthetic. Is this recycled, Carl? Saving the planet one gift at a time?" A ripple of laughter went through the room. It was polite, cruel laughter, the kind that signaled belonging to the in-group. "It is sturdy," my father said, his voice thick. He did not understand the joke, or perhaps he was choosing to ignore it to preserve his dignity. I wanted to make sure what is inside stayed safe. Lorraine glided over, the silk of her dress rustling. She peered at the box with exaggerated curiosity, like a scientist examining a rare insect. "Oh, Richard, be nice," she cooed, though her tone was dripping with condescension. "I am sure it is practical. Maybe it is some of those homemade cookies or spare parts?" Brooke chimed in from the sidelines, phone already in hand. Maybe he forgot to wrap the real gift and just grabbed the shipping box? The laughter grew louder. I stood frozen, my glass gripped so tightly I feared it might shatter in my palm. They saw a confused old man. They saw a cheap box. They saw a woman, me, who had lucked out by marrying the heir to a local real estate empire, a woman they assumed was riding their coattails. They had no idea. They did not know that the woman standing in the corner in the simple black dress was the founder and majority shareholder of Root Mosaic. They did not know that 3 days ago. My company had closed a funding round that valued my equity at a number that would make Richard Whitfield choke on his single malt scotch. They did not know that while they played at being wealthy, leveraging debt to buy status, I had built a fortress of liquid assets. I was not just rich. I was wealthy in a way that could swallow their entire leveraged lifestyle without burping. But more importantly, they did not know what was in the box. I forced a smile onto my face. It was a mask I had perfected over 5 years of marriage, 5 years of slights, 5 years of being treated like the help at family dinners. But behind that smile, I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. It was steel. It was the absolute certainty of the executioner. "Go on then, Richard," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. "Open it. Dad worked hard on it." Richard looked at me, surprised by my tone. He blinked, then shrugged, playing to his audience. All right, let us see what the mystery is. Drum roll, everyone." He carried the box to the center of the marble table, shoving aside a centerpiece of white orchids. The rough cardboard looked violent against the polished stone. He clawed at the duct tape. It was strong tape, applied by a man who knew how to seal things properly. And Richard struggled with it, his manicured fingernails scratching uselessly for a moment. "Need a box cutter?" Brooke called out. "Or maybe a blowtorch?" I got it, Richard grunted, finally finding a loose edge. He ripped the tape back with a harsh tearing sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. I saw Brooke raise her phone higher, the red recording light blinking. She was live-streaming this, or at least capturing it for the family group chat, ready to memify my father's poverty for her friends. Look at the cute little poor man and his tape. The caption would probably read, My father looked at me. His eyes were watery, filled with a mix of shame and hope. He wanted them to like it. He still, after all this time, thought that if he just showed them enough kindness, they would respect him. He did not know that respect was a currency these people did not possess. Richard pulled the flaps of the box open. The crowd leaned in, faces twisted in anticipation of another punchline, a set of hand-knitted coasters, a wooden birdhouse, a fruitcake. I took a deep breath, savoring the air in my lungs. I watched Richard's hand dive into the box. The room was still laughing, a low hum of amusement vibrating through the air. They were so confident in their superiority. They were so sure of their place in the world. They thought this was just another dinner, just another joke at the expense of the mechanic and his daughter. They did not know that the world as they knew it had ended the moment Richard broke that seal. They did not know that the contents of that box were about to dismantle the Whitfield legacy brick by brick. They were laughing at their own execution, and the sound of it was the sweetest thing I had ever heard. The sound of the tape ripping away from the cardboard was harsh and violent, a noise that did not belong in a room designed for soft acoustics and polite conversation. That sound, that specific friction of adhesive against paper, acted like a tripwire in my mind. It yanked me out of the glittering dining room and pulled me backward, dragging me through time to a place the Whitfields would not even drive through with their windows down. I was back in Fairview Heights. It was a gritty, gray working-class neighborhood in the Midwest, the kind of place where the houses sat close together and the fences were chain link rather than white picket. My mother had left when I was 6, unable to handle the quiet desperation of a life lived paycheck to paycheck. She walked out the door and left behind a silence that my father, Carl, filled with the hum of work. My childhood did not smell like imported pine or expensive perfume. It smelled of engine grease, rain on hot asphalt, and the metallic tang of the garage. Dad was a man of few words, but his hands spoke a language of absolute reliability. I remembered watching him in the driveway on freezing November evenings, his breath pluming in the air as he fixed Mrs. Higgins' radiator for free because he knew she needed her car to get to her dialysis appointments. He never asked for a dime. He just wiped his hands on a rag, smiled that shy, crooked smile, and told her to drive safe. I remembered the year I got accepted into the private preparatory school on a partial scholarship. It was a golden ticket, but the remaining tuition and the cost of textbooks were still a mountain we could not climb. That summer, I watched Dad disappear every evening after his shift at the factory ended. He would come back late, his truck bed loaded with scrap metal he had salvaged from construction sites and junkyards. He hauled rusted iron and copper wiring until his back seized up, selling it by the pound to the local recycling plant. When he finally handed me the stack of used textbooks, his knuckles were swollen and wrapped in bandages. He had looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes, and apologized. He told me he was sorry he could not buy me the new editions, the ones with the crisp pages that smelled like ink. He told me he was sorry he could not give me more. I had hugged him then, burying my face in his flannel shirt that smelled of oil and Old Spice, telling him that he had already given me the world. He had given me a chance. That specific ache, that mixture of pride and heartbreak, followed me all the way to the first time I introduced him to the Whitfields. I was 24, dating Noah, and completely naive to the unspoken rules of his world. We had been invited to dinner at the Whitfield main residence to celebrate Richard's birthday. I had spent 3 hours getting ready, agonizing over my appearance. I wore a navy blue dress I had bought off the rack at a department store clearance sale for $40. I thought I looked professional. I thought I looked nice. When I walked into their foyer, Lorraine and Brooke were waiting. Lorraine was wearing a silk blouse that shimmered like liquid silver, and Brooke was in a designer cocktail dress that she casually mentioned had cost $1,200 because it was a limited edition. They looked at me, their eyes scanning my outfit with the precision of a barcode scanner. They did not say anything mean outright. They just smiled those tight, pitying smiles. Lorraine reached out, fingering the polyester blend of my sleeve, and said, "Oh, how practical. That fabric is so durable, isn't it? Good for spillages." Dinner was an interrogation disguised as conversation. We sat around a long mahogany table, eating steak that cost more than my father's weekly grocery budget. Richard wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and turned his gaze on me. "So, Clara," he began, his voice booming, "Noah tells us your father is joining us for the wedding planning next month. Remind me, what line of work is he in? Finance? Law?" I swallowed a piece of steak that suddenly felt like sawdust. "He is a mechanic," I said, keeping my chin up. "He worked at the auto plant for 30 years. and now he does private repairs. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The interest in Richard's eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a glazed look of boredom. He said. Manual labor? Honest work, I suppose? He turned away immediately to ask Noah about the stock market, effectively dismissing my father's entire existence as a topic not worth discussing. Brooke, however, was not done. She leaned over her wine glass, her eyes dancing with amusement. A mechanic, she repeated. Does he have those industrial hands? You know, the ones that are always permanently stained? I hope he does not get confused by all the silverware at the wedding. It can be so overwhelming for people who are used to eating with their hands. The table erupted in laughter. It was light, airy laughter, as if she had just told a witty anecdote. I sat there, frozen, forcing a smile that felt like it was cracking the skin on my face. I swallowed the humiliation, pushing it down deep into my stomach where it burned like acid. I did not defend him. I was too scared, too desperate to fit in. That shame was a weight I still carried. Then came the wedding itself. It was a lavish affair, of course. My side of the guest list was small. Neighbors from Fairview Heights, a few cousins, and Dad. He wore the same charcoal suit he was wearing right now in the lake house. It was his only suit. He stood by the entrance of the ballroom, looking at the chandeliers with wide, awestruck eyes. Lorraine spent the entire reception complaining about the venue. She stood near the open bar, holding court with her friends, lamenting that the ballroom ceiling was 2 feet too low, and that the champagne was a vintage that was acceptable but hardly inspiring. She kept saying the location was not quite up to the Whitfield brand standards, speaking loud enough for my relatives to hear. But the moment that severed my soul from theirs happened during the gift opening the next day. The Whitfields had given us a honeymoon in the Maldives and a down payment on a starter home, gifts that came with strings attached, obligations to be grateful, to be beholden. They made sure everyone knew how much they had spent. Then, Noah opened my father's card. There was no big box, just a plain white envelope. Inside was a handwritten card and a check. The check was for $5,000. I knew exactly what that money represented. That was his entire savings. That was the money he had put aside for a rainy day, for his retirement, for emergencies. He had emptied his account to give us a start. The note inside was written in his shaky block letters. For your first dream, whatever that dream may be. Tears had welled up in my eyes immediately. I pressed the card to my chest. Looking across the room at him, he gave me a small, nervous nod, terrified that it was not enough. I excused myself to go to the kitchen to get a glass of water, needing a moment to compose myself. As I pushed open the swinging door, I heard them. Lorraine and Brooke were standing by the caterer's tray. They were holding the check. $5,000, Brooke snorted, giggling. That is cute. That barely covers the floral arrangement for the head table. Well, Lorraine sighed, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. It is probably a fortune to him. We should pretend to be thrilled. We can use it to tip the valet staff. It is about the right amount for that. They laughed. They laughed at the life savings of a man who had broken his back to raise me. They laughed at the sacrifice that had likely meant he would be eating canned soup for the next 6 months. I had stood there, hand on the door, paralyzed. I did not walk in and scream at them. I did not throw the water in their faces. I quietly let the door swing shut, turned around, and walked back to the party. I hugged my father and told him it was the most beautiful gift we had received. But inside, something in me had died. And something else, something cold and ruthless, had been born. And now, here we were again. The memory faded, superimposed by the reality of the lake house. The lighting was different, but the dynamic was identical. My father was standing there in the same charcoal suit, older now, his hair thinner, his hands shyer. He was surrounded by the same people who had mocked him for a decade. The room was grander, the stakes were higher, but the cruelty was exactly the same. They were looking at him like he was a stain on their perfect silk tapestry. But there was one difference this time. This time, I was not the scared 24-year-old girl in a cheap polyester dress. I was not the bride trying to keep the peace. I looked at my father, standing alone in the center of the room while Richard tore at the tape on the box. I looked at Lorraine, smirking behind her champagne flute. They saw a man who did not belong in their world. They did not realize that the man they were laughing at had raised a daughter who had learned how to dismantle engines before she learned how to drive. And they certainly did not realize that I had spent the last 10 years figuring out exactly which bolts to loosen to make their entire shiny golden machine fall apart. The past was a ghost, but the present was a weapon. And as Richard finally ripped the last strip of tape off the cardboard flaps, I knew he was pulling the pin on a grenade he did not even know he was holding. The offer letter from a Fortune 500 insurance firm had sat on my desk for 3 days. It promised a starting salary of $85,000 a year, full benefits, and a matching retirement plan. It was the safe bet. It was the path everyone expected me to take, especially after the Whitfields made it clear that marrying Noah did not mean I had access to their checkbook. I shredded it. Instead, I took the $5,000 my father had given us for our wedding, the money Lorraine had laughed at, and I poured every cent of it into a singular, obsessive vision. I called it Route Mosaic. It was a logistics software designed to optimize last-mile delivery routes for mid-sized trucking fleets, the kind of unsexy, invisible infrastructure that keeps the world moving. I did not have a glass-walled office. I had a rented desk in a co-working space that smelled permanently of damp carpet and microwaved fish. The furniture was mismatched, salvaged from failed startups that had come before me. My chair had a wobbly wheel that I fixed with duct tape, a poetic nod to my father's toolbox. Those early years were a blur of caffeine and code. I lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion. I stopped buying new clothes. I stopped getting haircuts. I ate instant noodles until the sodium made my fingers swell. There were nights when I would fall asleep with my cheek pressed against the keyboard at 3 a.m, only to wake up at 6 with key patterns imprinted on my skin, ready to debug another line of code. The Whitfields found my new career path amusing. To them, tech was something you hired a geek to fix when the Wi-Fi in the pool house went down. "It is such a cute project, Clara," Lorraine said to me at a 4th of July barbecue, waving a sparkler around with dangerous lack of coordination. "But really, darling, when you are ready to work, Richard says there is an opening in the internal audit department. It is entry level, but it is real business." "I am building a real business, Lorraine," I had replied, my voice tight. She just patted my cheek. "Of course you are. Just let us know when you want to stop playing with computers." They did not see the grit, but my father did. Carl came by the co-working space 2 or 3 times a week. He never came empty-handed. He would bring plastic containers filled with beef stew or chili, hearty, heavy food meant to keep a body going. He would sit in the corner of my cubicle, careful not to touch anything, just watching me type with a look of quiet, intense pride. One rainy Tuesday, I realized he was soaking wet. I asked him where his truck was. He told me he had left it at my apartment, so I would have a way to get to client meetings if my old sedan broke down. He had taken the bus across town, a 45-minute ride with 2 transfers, just to bring me dinner. "Dad, you cannot take the bus in this weather," I had argued, horrified. "The bus is fine, Clara," he said, peeling the lid off a container of macaroni and cheese. "You need the wheels more than I do. You are going places." He was right. I was going places, even if the Whitfields refused to look out the window to watch. The first crack in the dam happened 18 months in. I landed a contract with a regional shipping conglomerate. It was not a massive deal by Silicon Valley standards, but for me, it was everything. It was validation. It was revenue. It was proof that the algorithm worked. I signed the papers with a trembling hand. The moment the ink was dry, I picked up my phone. I called Noah first. He was in a meeting and sent a generic "call you back" text. Then I called my father. "Hello?" Carl answered on the first ring, his voice alert. "I got it, Dad," I said, tears pricking my eyes. I got the contract. 50 trucks. They are going to use root mosaic. I heard him exhale, a long, shaky sound. I knew it, he said. I never doubted it for a second. Sweetheart, not 1 second. Feeling bold, I decided to share the news with the Whitfield Family Updates group chat. I typed out a message. Big news! Root Mosaic just signed our first major regional partner. We are officially live across 3 states. I waited. I watched the read receipts pop up under the names. Lorraine, Richard, Brooke. 1 hour passed, then 2. Finally, Brooke reacted to the message. She sent a single thumbs up emoji. No text, no congratulations. Just a generic icon that took less than a second to tap. Beneath it, Lorraine wrote, Richard, did you remember to call the landscaper about the hydrangeas? They look thirsty. That was it. My career milestone was less important than their shrubs. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at the Midwest Tech Innovators Conference. It was a huge honor. I was the closing keynote speaker on the second day. I invited everyone. Noah came, sitting in the front row, looking proud but slightly out of his depth among the hoodies and laptops. The Whitfield family section, however, was empty. 10 minutes before I went on stage, I got a text from Brooke. So sorry we can't make it. Mom and I decided to do a last-minute spa weekend in Aspen. Tech talks really aren't our vibe, you know? Good luck with your speech. I walked onto that stage and delivered the presentation of my life. I spoke about efficiency, about the hidden patterns in chaos, about building something from nothing. The applause was thunderous, but as I looked out at the sea of clapping hands, the empty seats where my in-laws should have been felt like missing teeth in a smile. Then came the explosion. Root Mosaic hit a tipping point. Our software became the industry standard for mid-level logistics almost overnight. We attracted the attention of venture capital firms from the coast. Negotiations were intense, grueling, and exhilarating. When the news broke, it was everywhere. Root Mosaic raises Series B funding. Valuation hits $200 million. $200 million. I stared at the number on the screen of my laptop. It was a number so large it felt abstract. It was enough to buy the Whitfield Lake estate 10 times over and still have enough left to burn. My phone blew up. Former classmates I had not spoken to in a decade were messaging me. LinkedIn was a flood of notifications. I checked the Whitfield group chat. Surely this was undeniable. Surely they could not ignore a 9-figure valuation. The chat was active. There were 12 new messages. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scrolled up. Lorraine, does anyone think teal is too aggressive for the charity gala tablecloths? Brooke, definitely. Go with the ivory. Teal is so last season. Richard, make sure the wine list is updated. I don't want that cheap swill from last year. Nothing, not a word, not a syllable about the fact that their daughter-in-law had just built a financial empire that eclipsed their family's generational wealth. I put the phone down, feeling a strange mixture of hollowness and liberation. They were not ignoring me because they did not know. They were ignoring me because they knew, and they hated it. My success was an insult to their worldview. I was supposed to be the charity case, the mechanic's daughter they allowed into their circle. I was not supposed to be the winner. The door to my office opened. It was a new office now, small but clean, with windows that actually let in sunlight. Carl walked in. He was wearing his work boots and holding a cardboard carrier with 2 coffees and a plastic container of cupcakes from the supermarket down the street. The price sticker, $3.99, was still on the lid. I saw the news, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He placed the cupcakes on my desk next to my sleek MacBook. 200 million? I don't even know how many zeros that is. It is a lot of zeros, Dad, I said, standing up. He opened the plastic container. The cupcakes were red velvet with slightly smudged cream cheese frosting. We are going to celebrate, he insisted. Just you and me, the way we always do. We sat there in my office, drinking gas station coffee and eating cheap cupcakes, while the financial news networks ran segments about my company. It was the best meal I had ever had. As I watched my father carefully peel the paper wrapper off his cupcake, treating it like a precious object, I made a vow to myself. It was a silent, ironclad promise. I had spent years trying to earn the Whitfields' respect. I had endured their sneers, their polite exclusion, their jokes about my father's hands. I was done. If they ever came to me, if they ever tried to claim a piece of this victory, or if they ever dared to ask for help after spitting on the ground I walked on, I would not be the soft, eager-to-please Clara anymore. I would be the CEO who negotiated with sharks. I would be my father's daughter, bringing the hammer down. The silence from the Whitfields lasted for 3 weeks. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Lorraine. "Dearest Clara," it read. The tone was jarringly formal, overly affectionate, and completely out of character. "Richard and I are hosting a very special family gathering at the lake house next month. It is going to be an intimate affair. Just the core family. We would simply love for you and Noah to attend. It represents a new chapter for us all." I stared at the screen. Dearest, intimate, new chapter. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. They did not talk like this. Not to me. This wasn't an invitation to a party. It felt like a summons. It felt like a trap. Or perhaps, it felt like desperation masked as hospitality. I did not reply immediately. I let the message sit there, unread, while I finished my coffee. I knew something had shifted in the tectonic plates of the Whitfield Empire. I just did not know yet that the earthquake was already happening, and that I was the one who would be left standing in the rubble. I arrived at the Whitfield Lake Estate a day before the scheduled special family gathering. The invitation from Lorraine had been insistent, bordering on frantic, claiming they wanted quality time with Noah and me before the other guests arrived. I drove my modest hybrid up the winding gravel driveway, the tires crunching in a rhythm that usually signaled arrival at a sanctuary of wealth. However, as I slowed the car near the main entrance, the illusion of perfection flickered. A heavy-duty pickup truck, branded with the logo of a local landscaping firm, was peeling out of the service entrance. The driver, a thick-set man in a neon vest, looked furious. He was shouting something into his phone, his face a mask of red rage. And as he swerved past me, he didn't even tap his brakes. I watched him go in my rearview mirror, a cloud of dust settling behind him. I parked and stepped out. The house still looked imposing from a distance, a grand structure of cedar and stone, but as I walked up the path, my eyes, trained by years of debugging code to look for the smallest errors, began to catch the glitches in the matrix. There was a copper gutter above the garage that had detached at the seam, allowing a dark stain of water damage to creep down the pristine siding. It had been raining recently, and the leak was active, a slow rhythmic drip that no one had bothered to fix. To the left, the ambitious extension of the patio, which Richard had bragged about last Christmas, sat abandoned. There were piles of dirt covered in blue tarps, and the excavator parked nearby had weeds growing around its tracks. It looked less like a construction site and more like a graveyard for a project that had run out of fuel. I walked into the house through the unlocked side door. It was quiet. Too quiet for a home that usually bustled with housekeepers and caterers before a big event. "Hello?" I called out softly. No answer. I moved through the hallway toward the kitchen, passing Richard's study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I heard a voice. Richard's. But it lacked its usual booming baritone quality. It was tight, high-pitched, and laced with a panic I had never heard before. "I am telling you, the liquidity is coming," Richard was saying. I paused. My breath held. "You cannot pull the financing now. The lake house is the pillar asset of the brand. If you file the lien, everything dominoes. Just give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks, damn it!" There was a silence. Then the sound of a phone being slammed down onto a desk hard enough to rattle a lamp. I stepped back quickly, retreating to the kitchen before he could come out and see me. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of a hunter who has just caught a scent. Minutes later, Noah wandered in from the patio, looking distracted. He kissed my cheek. but his eyes were darting around the room. "Is everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "The place seems a bit unfinished outside, and your dad sounds stressed." Noah waved a hand dismissively, but the gesture was stiff. "You know how he is. The townhouse project downtown is hitting some supply chain snags. It is just the normal real estate cycle. High risk, high reward. He is just venting." "Cycles usually don't involve abandoned excavators," I noted. "It is fine, Clara," Noah snapped, then immediately softened. "Sorry, everyone is just on edge. It is a big party tomorrow. A rebranding, basically." I nodded, but I did not buy it. Rebranding was corporate speak for, "We need to change the narrative because the current one is failing." Later that afternoon, I drove back into town to meet my father. We met at his small kitchen table in his rental apartment. The contrast was stark. While the Whitfield estate was crumbling under the weight of pretension, Dad's place was warm, clean, and honest. He made me a cup of instant coffee. He looked troubled. "I saw something odd the other day," Carl said, staring into his mug. "At the credit union." My father had banked at the Fairview Community Credit Union for 40 years. It was a blue-collar institution, the kind of place where the tellers knew your grandchildren's names and where loans were given based on character as much as credit scores. It was the antithesis of the boutique investment banks the Whitfields used. "What did you see?" I asked. "You know old Stan, the branch manager?" Carl hesitated. "He retired last month. The new management. They are stricter. I was in there asking about refinancing my truck, and the loan officer had a stack of files on his desk. He got called away for a second." Carl looked up at me, his eyes wide. The top file was marked Whitfield Ridge Holdings, and underneath it, there was a letterhead from a group called Ironbridge Capital. My brow furrowed. "Ironbridge? That is a predatory lending firm. They buy bad debt. Why would a file for Richard's company be sitting on a desk at your neighborhood credit union?" "That is what I wondered," Dad said. "Why would big shots like them be borrowing from our little co-op?" The question gnawed at me. I left Dad's apartment and went straight to my office. I fired up my laptop and logged into the public records database. I did not need to be a hacker. I just needed to know where to look. I spent the next 6 hours following the paper trail, and what I found was a map of a sinking ship. Whitfield Ridge Holdings was not just having a bad quarter, they were insolvent. The townhouse project Noah had mentioned was currently facing 3 separate lawsuits from unpaid contractors, including the landscaping company I had seen leaving the estate. There were liens against their commercial properties. But the smoking gun was exactly where my father had pointed. 3 years ago, when the big banks had likely tightened the tap on Richard due to over-leveraging, the Whitfields had gotten desperate. They had taken out a massive personal line of credit from the Fairview Community Credit Union. They had likely walked in there, flashed their expensive watches, and dazzled the local loan board into thinking lending to the Whitfields was a prestige move for the small branch. They had used the lake house and a 40% stake in their company as collateral. I looked at the payment history. It was a disaster. They had been paying interest only for 18 months, and for the last 3 months, they had missed payments entirely. They were treating my father's credit union, the place that held the savings of teachers and factory workers, like a piggy bank they did not have to respect. They assumed the small neighborhood bank wouldn't have the guts to foreclose on a Whitfield. But they were wrong. The files showed that the credit union, under pressure from regulators to clean up its books, had classified the Whitfield loan as toxic. They were preparing to bundle it and sell the debt to a third party for immediate liquidity. That was where Ironbridge Capital came in. They were circling. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the dark office. The irony was suffocating. The people who had laughed at my father's $5,000 check, who had mocked his poverty, were currently surviving on the mercy of the very institution that stored his money. They were not kings. They were beggars in velvet coats. I drove back to my father's place late that night. He was still up, watching the news. I sat down across from him and told him what I had found. I laid it all out. The liens, the unpaid contractors, and the loan that was about to default at his credit union. Carl sat in silence for a long time. Then, he sighed, a heavy, burdened sound. "That poor credit union," he said softly. "If the Whitfields default, it will hurt the members. It might hurt people I know. Maybe I should talk to Richard? Warn him?" He looked at me with those kind, tired eyes. "I would hate to see them lose their home. Clara, even after everything, it is a terrible thing to lose your home." I reached across the table and took his rough, calloused hands in mine. His fingernails still had traces of oil under them. "Dad," I said, my voice firm, "look at me." He met my gaze. "You do not owe them your empathy," I told him. "They have spent 10 years making you feel small, so they could feel big. They mocked the money you saved by working yourself to the bone, and while they were doing that, they were secretly taking money from your bank to buy champagne they could not afford." I squeezed his hands. "You are not going to warn them. You are not going to save them. They built this house of cards. They chose the materials." "But what happens when the bank sells the debt?" he asked. "Ironbridge will tear them apart." A cold, sharp plan clicked into place in my mind. It was perfect. It was symmetric. It was the only ending this story could possibly have. "Ironbridge is not going to buy the debt, Dad," I said, a dangerous calmness settling over me. "They aren't?" "No," I said, "because we are going to buy it first." I saw the confusion in his eyes, followed by the slow dawn of understanding. I was not just going to watch the Whitfields fall. I was going to be the one holding the deed when they hit the ground. The investigation was over. The acquisition was about to begin. The next morning, the timeline accelerated with the brutal efficiency of a falling guillotine. My father called me at 7 o'clock sharp. He had spoken to a former colleague who still worked in the back office of the credit union. The board had voted. They were not waiting until the end of the quarter to scrub their books. The Whitfield debt package, labeled as a distressed asset, was going up for private auction to qualified buyers within 48 hours. They were looking for a quick exit. They wanted to wash their hands of Richard Whitfield's delusions before the regulators stepped in. "They are selling it to the highest bidder who can prove immediate liquidity," Dad told me, his voice low. "Ironbridge is already preparing an offer. I heard the number. It is low. Clara, pennies on the dollar." "Ironbridge won't get the chance," I said, already pulling my blazer on. "I am going to outbid them, and I am going to do it before they even finish their coffee." I needed a vehicle. If I bought the debt under my own name, or even under Route Mosaic, the Whitfields might get wind of it through the grapevine. Richard had friends in low places, and I could not risk him finding out I was the shark circling his boat. I needed a ghost. By noon, I had legally incorporated a holding company. I named it Marlowe Ridge Partners. It sounded boring, established, and vaguely geographical. It sounded like the kind of faceless entity that managed pension funds or insurance portfolios. It was a name designed to be ignored. I called Jenna Locke. Jenna was a corporate litigator I had met during my Series B funding rounds. She was terrifyingly smart, dressed exclusively in monochromatic suits, and had a reputation for finding loopholes that other lawyers missed. When I explained the situation to her, the debt, the collateral, the personal grudge disguised as a business transaction, she didn't laugh. She didn't ask if I was sure. She just opened her laptop. "If we want the credit union to bypass the auction and sell directly to us," Jenna said, her fingers flying across the keyboard, "we need to offer them a premium over what Ironbridge would pay, but still at a significant discount against the actual value of the assets. We offer them a clean break, immediate wire transfer, no due diligence period. We buy the debt as is." "Do it," I said. "Use the liquidity from my personal holdings. Keep Route Mosaic out of the direct line of fire, but use my equity as the proof of funds." It was a gamble. I was liquidating a significant portion of my personal wealth to buy the debt of a failing company run by incompetence. If the real estate market crashed tomorrow, or if the Whitfields had hidden liabilities I hadn't found, I could lose millions. But looking at the file, seeing the arrogance inherent in their payment history, I knew this was the only investment that mattered. The transaction took 3 days. Jenna handled the paperwork with surgical precision. The credit union was so relieved to get the toxic Whitfield loan off their books that they didn't ask too many questions about who was behind Marlowe Ridge Partners. They just saw the wire transfer hit their account, signed the assignment of deed, and handed over the keys to the kingdom. I sat in Jenna's office, looking at the stack of documents. I now owned the mortgage on the Whitfield Lake estate. I owned the lien on their commercial properties. I owned the rights to 40% of Whitfield Ridge Holdings. So, Jenna said, leaning back in her chair and tapping a pen against her chin, we have the leverage. We can file for foreclosure immediately. They are technically in default. No, I said, staring at the signature on the loan document. Richard's signature was large and looped, taking up twice the space it needed. Not yet. Their next payment is due on the 15th. That is 4 days from now. You want to see if they miss it? I want them to have 0 excuses, I replied. If we move now, they will claim it was a clerical error, or that they were just about to pay. I want the breach of contract to be absolute. Let them miss the 15th. Let the grace period expire. I want the trap to be snapped shut so tight that not even a molecule of air can escape. The 15th came and went. The payment was not made. In fact, I could see the internal notes from the credit union transfer. Richard had called to ask for another extension, citing cash flow timing. The credit union, now no longer the holder of the note, had simply told him that the account was under administrative review, a polite deflection. The trap was set. Now, I just needed the venue. That was when the true nature of the special family gathering became clear. It wasn't just a dinner. I did some digging on social media and found the digital invitations Brooke had sent out to her circle. It was Richard and Lorraine's 30th wedding anniversary. But more than that, they were billing it as the Whitfield Renaissance Gala. They had invited local politicians, potential investors, and high society influencers. They were going to use the event to announce a major new direction for the company. Essentially, they were going to lie to investors to raise fresh capital to pay off the old debts. They were going to stand on a stage built on quicksand and pretend they were standing on bedrock. I drove to my father's apartment that evening. The plan in my head had crystallized into something theatrical, something that required his participation. "Dad," I said, sitting him down, "we own the debt. Marlowe Ridge Partners is the legal creditor. We can take the house whenever we want." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a week. "So it is over? You are going to call them?" "No," I said. "We are going to the party." I explained the concept to him. I told him about the box. "I want you to bring a gift," I said, "but not a nice one. I want you to bring a cardboard box, an old ugly shipping box. Tape it up with duct tape. Make it look like you grabbed it from the recycling bin 5 minutes before you left." Carl frowned, confused. "Why? They will make fun of me. Clara, they always do." "Exactly," I said, leaning in. "I need them to make fun of you. I need them to be so busy laughing at the packaging that they don't realize what they are holding. I need them to show everyone in that room exactly who they are." "And what goes inside?" he asked. 2 layers, I explained. On top, we put junk, sentimental things that look worthless to them. We spent the next hour curating the top layer. We found the spare key to the basement apartment we had lived in when I was in high school, a tarnished, brass key that went to a door that no longer existed. We found a Polaroid photo of my first office, the one with the water stain on the ceiling. And finally, Carl went to his toolbox and pulled out his old tape measure. It was battered, the yellow metal casing scratched and dented from 30 years of factory work. "This built everything we have," he said softly, running his thumb over the metal. "Put it in," I said. "They will see trash. We know it is treasure. That is the point." Then came the bottom layer. We cut a piece of cardboard to create a false bottom. Beneath it, I placed the file. It was a thick stack of papers, flagged with colorful sticky tabs. Exhibit A, Notice of Default. Exhibit B, Assignment of Debt to Marlowe Ridge Partners. Exhibit C, Foreclosure proceedings. Exhibit D. Personal guarantee enforcement. I placed a cover letter on top, printed on heavy cream-colored bond paper with the Marlowe Ridge Partners letterhead. It was a formal demand for immediate payment of the full principal balance, $4.2 million, or immediate surrender of the collateral. We taped the false bottom down, then we threw the key, the photo, and the tape measure on top. My father sealed the box. He used the gray duct tape, pulling it off the roll with a loud, ripping sound. He wrapped it around the box once, then twice, making it look crude and hasty. He took a black marker and wrote, "For Richard and Lorraine" on the lid. He looked at the box, then at me. For the first time in years, the hunch in his shoulders disappeared. He didn't look like the poor mechanic anymore. He looked like a man holding a loaded gun. "They are going to laugh," Carl said, a strange calmness in his voice. "They are going to pass this around and make jokes about how cheap I am." "Yes," I answered. "They are going to think it is the punchline to a joke. They won't realize it is a gavel." "And when they open the bottom?" "When they open the bottom," I said, "the party is over, not just the gala, the whole charade. We are forcing them to look at you, really look at you, and realize that the man they treated like dirt is the man who now owns the ground they are standing on." I stood up and smoothed my skirt. "We are not just taking their money, Dad. We are taking their narrative. We are going to let them hang themselves with their own arrogance, in front of the very audience they tried to impress." The plan was cruel. It was calculating. It was something the old Clara, the one who just wanted to be accepted, never could have conceived. But that Clara was gone. She had been replaced by the CEO of Marlowe Ridge Partners, and she was ready to close the deal of a lifetime. The evening of the gala arrived, and the Whitfield Lake estate had been transformed into a stage set for a play that nobody knew was a tragedy except for me. The transformation was aggressive. It was as if Richard and Lorraine had decided that if they threw enough money at their problems, the problems would simply be dazzled into submission. I drove up the long, winding driveway in my 7-year-old hybrid sedan. I had left my luxury SUV, the one I had bought with my Root Mosaic dividends, parked safely in my garage at home. Tonight, I needed to play the role they had cast me in a decade ago. I needed to be the modest, practical daughter-in-law who did not quite fit the aesthetic. Beside me, my father sat with the cardboard box on his lap. He was gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white, treating that battered package like it contained the crown jewels. As we crested the hill, the house came into view. It was blinding. They had rented industrial uplights to wash the stone facade in a golden glow. A string quartet was set up on the wraparound porch, playing Vivaldi with grim determination against the cool lake breeze. There were waiters in white tuxedos weaving through the crowd with silver trays, and a professional photographer was snapping photos of guests as they stepped out of their limousines. It was a masterclass in deception. I pulled my car up to the valet stand, right behind a Bentley. The valet, a young man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, opened my door with a practiced, neutral expression that barely concealed his judgment of my vehicle. Then he opened the passenger door for Carl. My father stepped out, clutching the box. The duct tape caught the reflection of the golden floodlights, looking gray and ugly against the shimmer of the evening. "Sir," the valet said, reaching out, "I can take that trash for you. There is a bin around the back." My father froze. He looked down at the box, then at the valet. "It is not trash," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is a gift." The valet blinked, clearly confused, but backed off. "My apologies, sir." I walked around the car and took my father's arm. "Ignore him, Dad," I whispered. "Just hold on to it." Noah was waiting for us at the top of the stone steps. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but there were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. He was vibrating with tension. When he saw us, he descended the stairs quickly, bypassing the photographer who tried to flag him down. "Clara," he said, kissing my cheek. His lips were cold. He turned to my father and pulled him into a hug that lingered for a second too long. "Carl, I am glad you came." "Happy anniversary to your folks," Dad said, patting the box. Noah looked at the box, then at me. His eyes darted back to the house, where through the open French doors we could see his parents holding court. Listen, Noah whispered, leaning in close so the other guests wouldn't hear. I know things have been weird. I know Mom and Dad have been difficult, but I want you to know I am on your side tonight. Whatever happens. I looked at him. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I saw the way his gaze kept flickering back to the massive house, to the life of comfort he had always known. He was a good man, but he was a man standing on a fault line, trying to keep his balance while the earth shifted. I know, Noah, I said simply. Let us go inside. The interior of the house was suffocatingly opulent. The air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and expensive lilies. Lorraine was in the center of the foyer, wearing a gold-sequined gown that looked heavy enough to sink a ship. She was laughing, a high, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. She was gripping the arm of the mayor, telling him about the exciting expansion plans for the next quarter. She spotted us and her smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. She excused herself and glided over, trailing the scent of Chanel No. 5. Clara and Carl, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. You made it. And look, you brought something. Her eyes flicked to the cardboard box, and she let out a short, dismissive breath through her nose. Well, just put it on the gift table in the dining room. Try to put it towards the back, maybe. We don't want to clutter the display. We will keep it close, I said. Dad wants to give it to you personally. Lorraine shrugged, clearly uninterested. Suit yourself. Just try not to block the photographer's line of sight. We are doing a spread for the local lifestyle magazine. She swirled away before we could respond. I scanned the room. It was a who's who of the people Richard owed money to, though most of them didn't know it yet. There were contractors he was stringing along with promises of future projects. There were investors he was wooing for bridge loans. They were all drinking his wine and eating his shrimp, completely unaware that the man hosting them was technically destitute. Brooke was near the fireplace, holding her phone up at a 45-degree angle. She was live streaming. Hey guys, she chirped into the screen, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the room. We are here at the Whitfield Renaissance Gala. Look at these flowers. It is all about legacy tonight. Honoring the past, building the future. Mom and Dad are literally couple goals. Stay tuned for the unboxing later. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a woman in a sharp navy blazer and trousers. She held a glass of sparkling water and blended perfectly into the crowd, looking like just another corporate guest. It was Jenna Locke. Lovely party, Jenna said, her voice low and even. The shrimp is excellent, although I do wonder how they paid the caterer. I ran a check this morning. The catering company has a lien filed against a different developer. They usually demand cash up front now. Richard probably put it on a personal card that hasn't maxed out yet, I replied, taking a glass of champagne from a passing tray but not drinking it. Is everything ready? Jenna nodded once, a microscopic movement. The paperwork is in my bag. Not the box. My bag. Just in case we need legal reinforcement. But the deed assignment is recorded. As of midnight last night, the grace period officially expired. You are the captain of this ship. Clara, you can sink it whenever you give the signal. I looked across the room at my father. He had found a chair near the edge of the dining room, far away from the center of attention. He was sitting alone. The other guests gave him a wide berth, their eyes sliding over his cheap suit and the taped-up box on his lap. He looked small. He looked out of place. But he didn't look scared anymore. He was watching Richard loud talk a group of investors, and there was a strange, sad wisdom in Dad's eyes. He knew what false pride looked like. He had seen men lie about broken engines before, claiming they just needed a tune-up when the transmission was shot. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Dinner was served, a 4-course meal that dragged on for 2 hours. Richard gave a toast that lasted 20 minutes. He spoke about resilience and vision. He used the word empire 6 times. He talked about how the Whitfield name was synonymous with trust. I sat there, cutting my lamb into tiny pieces, feeling the cold steel of the plan in my mind. Every lie he told, every arrogant boast, was just adding another weight to the scale. Finally, the plates were cleared. Lorraine stood up and clinked a silver spoon against her crystal glass. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for sharing this magical evening with us," she announced, beaming. "As is our tradition, we like to end the night with a symbolic exchange of gifts among the family. It is our way of showing that love is the true currency of the Whitfield legacy." There was a polite ripple of applause. "We will start with the immediate family," Lorraine continued. "Richard and I have received so many beautiful tributes already, but please, let us gather around the main table." The guests shifted their chairs, turning to watch. The photographer moved into position, his flash charging with a high-pitched whine. Brooke set up a ring light on a tripod. "Dad," I whispered, touching his arm. "It is time." Carl stood up. He picked up the box. He walked toward the main table, where a mountain of glossy gift bags and velvet-wrapped packages already sat. He placed his cardboard box right in the center, next to a Tiffany blue bag that was 3 times its size. The contrast was violent. The gray duct tape looked like a scar against the white tablecloth. The room went quiet. A few people chuckled nervously. Lorraine's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered, tilting her head in that condescending way she had perfected. I stood just behind my father. I felt the heat of the room, the eyes of the judgment, the weight of 10 years of silence. I looked at Richard, who was staring at the box with open disdain. I looked at Lorraine, who was already composing the apology she would make to her friends for her in-laws' lack of taste. They thought the box was the joke. They thought they were the audience, and we were the entertainment. I took a deep breath. The doubt that had sometimes whispered to me in the middle of the night, the fear that I was being too harsh, that I should just write them a check and walk away, evaporated completely. They had built a stage for their own glorification. It was only fitting that we used it for their eviction. "Go ahead, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "They have been waiting for this." Richard cleared his throat, tapping a silver spoon against the side of his champagne flute, until the crystal rang out like a bell. The room fell into a hush, the kind of respectful silence usually reserved for church services or the reading of a will. He stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, looking every inch the captain of industry he desperately pretended to be. "Family," Richard began, his voice booming with practiced gravitas, "and friends who are family, tonight is not just about celebrating 30 years of marriage to my beautiful Lorraine. It is about legacy. It is about the audacity to dream. You see, building Whitfield Ridge was never just about bricks and mortar. It was about risk. It was about having the courage to look at a piece of empty land and see a future where others saw nothing. It takes a special kind of bravery to build an empire, and tonight we celebrate that bravery." He raised his glass. "To the Whitfield legacy, may it stand for another 100 years." "To the legacy," the guests chorused, raising their glasses in a synchronized wave of expensive alcohol. I took a sip of water, watching him over the rim of my glass. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. He was toasting to bravery while hiding behind a wall of unpaid bills. He was talking about seeing a future while being legally blind to the cliff edge he was standing on. The applause died down, and the gift ceremony began. It was a spectacle of excess. The first gift was from the mayor, a massive leather-bound first edition of a history of the county, likely costing $2,000. Richard accepted it with a nod of solemn appreciation. Next came a Jeroboam of vintage Cabernet from a business partner, the bottle so large it required 2 hands to hold. Then, a cousin presented a custom-made oil painting of the lake house, rendered in soft, romantic strokes that conveniently left out the leaking gutters and the abandoned excavator in the yard. Every time a gift was unwrapped, the room erupted in polite, enthusiastic applause. The photographer circled like a shark, his flash popping in rapid bursts. Brooke was directing the scene from behind her phone, whispering instructions to her mother about angles. Chin up. Mom, hold the wine label toward the light. Perfect. The pile of open treasures grew. Silk scarves, a humidor made of rare cedar, a set of engraved fountain pens. The table looked like a shrine to materialism. The air smelled of greed and expensive perfume. Then, the supply of velvet boxes and satin ribbons ran out. All that remained on the table, sitting in the shadow of a crystal vase, was my father's cardboard box. Lorraine paused. She looked at the box, then at the guests, and a tight, performative smile stretched across her face. It was the smile of a benevolent queen deigning to acknowledge a peasant. Well, she said, clasping her hands together, it seems we have one left. And you know, at Whitfield Ridge, we believe in inclusivity. We open every gift, no matter how rustic the presentation. A ripple of laughter went through the room. It was low and soft, but it cut deep. Oh, absolutely, a man in a pinstripe suit near the end of the table called out, grinning. Did Amazon misdeliver a shipment of spare parts? The laughter grew louder. My father stiffened in his chair. I saw his hand twitch, wanting to reach out and take the box back, but he held his ground. Richard sighed, playing the role of the long-suffering patriarch. Let us see what we have here, he said, reaching for the box. He grabbed the lid, but the duct tape held fast. My father had sealed it tight. Richard pulled, and the tape made a loud, screeching "rah" sound that tore through the sophisticated atmosphere like a fart in an elevator. Lorraine winced visibly. Goodness, she murmured. It is certainly secure. Richard grunted, using his fingernail to scrape at the edge of the tape. Carl, did you seal this with industrial adhesive? I feel like I'm trying to break into a vault. It is just duct tape, my father said softly. Right. Well, determination. I like it. Richard gave one final, violent yank. The tape gave way. Taking a layer of the cardboard with it, the flaps sprang open. Brooke moved in closer with her phone. Unboxing time, she announced to her followers. Let's see what kind of vintage chic we are dealing with. Richard reached into the box. He frowned, his hand rummaging around the top layer. First, he pulled out the key. It was an old brass key, tarnished and dull, attached to a faded plastic tag that read, Apt 4B. It was the key to the 2-bedroom basement apartment my father and I had lived in for 15 years. Richard held it up by the key ring, dangling it like a dead mouse. A key, he announced flatly, to a safe deposit box? A diary? It looks like it belongs to a haunted house, Brooke giggled. Richard reached in again. He pulled out the photograph. It was a Polaroid, slightly yellowed with age. It showed me at 23, sitting at a folding table in a windowless room, grinning maniacally next to my first server rack. And a photo, Richard said, squinting at it, of Clara in a storage closet? That was my first office, I said, my voice steady. Charming, Lorraine said, her voice dripping with insincerity. So, humble? Finally, Richard reached in and pulled out the tape measure. It was heavy, encased in scratched yellow metal, with the brand name almost worn off from decades of use. The metal tongue at the end was slightly bent. It was the tool of a man who measured twice and cut once, a tool that had built shelves, fixed engines, and put food on my table. Richard held it in his palm, staring at it as if it were an alien artifact. He looked at the crystal goblets on the table, then at the dirty yellow tape measure. The contrast was so absurd, so visually jarring, that for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Brooke did, though. Oh my God, she laughed, a high, breathy sound. It is totally vintage. That distressed metal look is so in right now for, like, industrial loft aesthetics. Did you find it at an estate sale, Carl? The guests took their cue. They laughed. It wasn't the polite laughter from before. This was mocking laughter. They were laughing at the absurdity of this junk sitting on their marble table. It is a tape measure, A woman with pearl earrings whispered to her husband, loud enough for us to hear. "Who brings a used tape measure to an anniversary party? Is that it?" I heard the whisper. My father heard it too. I saw the color rise in Carl's neck. His ears turned a painful shade of red. He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together. He started to stand up, his chair scraping against the floor. I should have gotten something else," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I just thought, because it was meaningful. I wish I could have done more." He was apologizing. He was apologizing to these vultures for offering them the symbols of his life's work. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on his forearm. I didn't squeeze it in comfort. I gripped it with strength. I was anchoring him. "Do not apologize." My touch said, "Do not you dare apologize to them." "Sit down, Dad," I said softly, but with a command in my tone. Richard sensed the awkwardness spiraling. He decided to spin it. He put on his best benevolent smile, the one he used when he was rejecting a loan applicant. Now, Richard said, holding up his hands. "Let us not be rude. It is a symbolic gift, a reminder of humble beginnings, right, Carl? We all start somewhere. Some of us start with tape measures. Some of us start with grand visions. It is a nice reminder of how far we have all come. Thank you. Carl, really, it is very grounding." He said grounding the way one might say dirty. "Yes, very sweet," Lorraine added, waving her hand dismissively. "We will find a place for it, maybe in the garage or the gardening shed. It would look perfect out there." She signaled to a waiter. "Please clear this away so we can bring out the dessert." Richard began to slide the box across the marble table, pushing it aside as if it were a plate of uneaten food. He was already turning away, ready to accept a glass of port, ready to forget the mechanic and his trash. He was done with us. We were just a blip in his evening of glory. I watched his hand push the box. I watched the gray duct tape slide against the white stone. "Wait," I said. The word was not loud, but it projected with the clarity of a bell tolling in a valley. Richard stopped. He looked at me, annoyed. "Clara, we are moving on. The dessert wine is being served." I stood up. I didn't rush. I smoothed the front of my black dress and looked Richard dead in the eye. I didn't smile. "You are not done, Richard," I said. "You barely looked at it." "I saw the key and the tape. Clara," he snapped, his patience fraying. "It is very sentimental. We get it." "No," I replied, my voice dropping an octave, becoming something cold and heavy. "I don't think you do get it. Those were just the garnish." I walked around the table. The heels of my shoes clicked rhythmically on the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. The sound drew every eye in the room. The waiter with the dessert tray paused. The string quartet lowered their bows. I stopped right next to Richard. I reached out and put my hand on the box, halting its movement. "You really should check the packaging more carefully," I said, my gaze sweeping over Lorraine, then Brooke, and finally landing back on Richard. "I think you haven't opened the most important part yet." The silence that followed was sudden and absolute. It wasn't the respectful silence of the toast. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room that suddenly realizes the joke is no longer funny. "Lift the cardboard liner." "Richard," I said. My voice was not loud, but in the sudden vacuum of sound that had swallowed the room, it carried like a gunshot. Richard looked at me with a mixture of confusion and annoyance, his hand hovering over the box. He looked like a man trying to decide if he was being pranked or threatened. "The liner? Clara, this is ridiculous. I am not digging through—" "Lift it," I repeated. This time, it was an order. Grumbling, Richard jammed his thumb against the edge of the false bottom my father and I had cut so carefully the night before. He pried it up. The piece of cardboard bent, then popped out, revealing the hidden compartment beneath. There were no old keys or rusty tape measures in this layer. Lying neatly inside was a stack of thick, legal-sized documents, clipped together with heavy black binder clips and flagged with neon-colored sticky tabs. Sitting right on top was a cover letter printed on high-quality, cream-colored bond paper. The letterhead was embossed in dark navy ink, crisp and professional. Marlowe Ridge Partners, LLC. I watched Richard's eyes lock onto that name. I saw the precise moment the recognition hit him. He blinked. Once, twice, as if trying to clear a hallucination. He knew that name. He had likely spent the last 48 hours cursing that name in private calls with his lawyers, wondering who this mysterious entity was that had snapped up his debt so aggressively. Lorraine, standing beside him, had not caught up yet. She leaned in, a glass of champagne still dangling from her fingers, her face twisted in a mask of polite confusion. "What is this?" she asked, her laugh nervous and high-pitched. "A scrapbook? Oh, Carl. Did you put together a photo album of the grandkids? That is quaint?" She reached out and picked up the top document. Her smile froze. It was not a photo album. It was a formal notice of default and acceleration of debt. Lorraine's eyes darted across the page, scanning the bolded headers. I watched her lips move silently as she read the words that no socialite ever wants to see at her own party. Transfer of lien, foreclosure proceedings, immediate repossession of assets. "I don't understand," she whispered, the color draining from her face so fast it looked like the blood had simply evaporated. "Richard? What is this? Why does it say our address?" Richard snatched the papers from her hand. His face, which had been flushed with wine and arrogance just moments ago, turned a sickly, ash-gray color. He flipped through the pages frantically. He saw the loan numbers. He saw the amount outstanding, $4.2 million. He saw the signature of the credit union director transferring the note. And then he saw the signature on the bottom of the acceptance line. Clara Harmon Whitfield, managing partner. He looked up at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish thrown onto a dock, gasping for air that wasn't there. "You," he croaked. "Marlowe Ridge. That is you?" "It is a holding company," I said, my voice calm, addressing the entire room now. I turned slightly to face the guests, the investors, the people Richard had spent all night lying to. Marlowe Ridge Partners was formed specifically to acquire distressed assets, and 3 days ago, we acquired the full debt portfolio of Whitfield Ridge Holdings from the Fairview Community Credit Union. A gasp went through the room. It was audible, sharp, and collective. The string quartet, realizing the mood had shifted from celebration to execution, stopped playing mid-measure. The cellist lowered his bow, staring wide-eyed at the head table. "That is impossible," Richard stammered, shaking the papers at me. "The credit union, they wouldn't. We have a relationship. I was negotiating an extension." "You were in default for 90 days. Richard," I corrected him. "You missed 3 consecutive payment cycles. You ignored 5 certified letters. You treated the bank my father has used for 40 years like they were a joke because you thought they were too small to fight back. You were wrong." I took a step closer to the table, pointing at the documents in his hand. "You thought that box was full of trash," I said. "You laughed at it. You made your guests laugh at it. But that box contains the deed to this house. It contains the lien on your commercial properties. It contains the personal guarantee you signed 3 years ago putting up your own stock as collateral. That box isn't a gift. Richard, it is an eviction notice." The room was dead silent. The guests were paralyzed. The phones that had been recording stories for Instagram were slowly lowered, screens going dark. This was not the kind of content anyone wanted to be associated with. This was the smell of death, social and financial death. This is illegal," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. He was sweating now, beads of perspiration popping out on his forehead. "You can't just buy my debt. I was not notified. This is a hostile takeover. It is fraud." "It is entirely legal." A cool, sharp voice cut in from the side of the room. Jenna Locke stepped out of the shadows. She walked toward the main table, her heels striking the floor with authority. She didn't look like a party guest anymore. She looked like a shark in a blazer. "My name is Jenna Locke," Legal counsel for Marlowe Ridge Partners, she announced. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thinner, but equally official, file. The assignment of debt was notarized and filed with the county clerk at 9 o'clock yesterday morning. The notification was sent to your registered business address via courier, which your secretary signed for at 10:30 this morning. You just didn't read it because you were too busy preparing for a party. Jenna placed her file on the table next to the half-eaten cake. Here is the proof of funds, she continued, pointing to a line item. Marlowe Ridge Partners paid the principal in full. The credit union is out. We are the creditor now. And since the grace period for your missed payment expired at midnight last night, my client is exercising her right to accelerate the loan. The full amount is due immediately. Richard looked at the papers, then at Jenna, then at me. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to jump up and say this was all a misunderstanding, but the investors were looking at their shoes. The mayor was suddenly very interested in his napkin. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one, and they were already mentally swimming for the lifeboats. $4 million, Richard whispered, his voice trembling with rage. You expect me to write a check for $4 million tonight? No, I said. I know you don't have it. I saw your financials. Richard, I know about the liquidity crunch. I know about the second mortgage you tried to hide. I know you are insolvent. Lorraine let out a small, strangled sob. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles white, swaying as if she were about to faint. So, I continued, relentless, since you cannot pay, the collateral triggers, the house, the company stock, it all reverts to Marlowe Ridge, to me. I gestured to the box again. I told you, Dad brought you the most important thing in the world. He brought you the truth. The truth is, you don't own this empire anymore. You are trespassing. Richard slammed his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. You ungrateful little witch, he screamed. Losing all composure, spittle flew from his mouth. After everything we gave you, we let you into this family. We gave you a name, and you use your little tech money to try and steal my life? I didn't steal anything, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that was scarier than his shouting. I bought it. I bought it at the discount price you put on it when you decided you were too good to pay your bills. Brooke was sitting in her chair, phone in her lap, staring at me with her mouth open. She looked like a child who had just been told Santa Claus was actually a repo man. But my apartment? She squeaked. The company lease pays for my apartment. Not anymore, I said, not even looking at her. The reality of it was settling in, the grandeur of the evening, the lights, the music, the champagne, had dissolved, leaving only the ugly, jagged wreckage of their finances exposed for everyone to see. They were stripped bare. Lorraine turned slowly toward where my father was sitting. Carl hadn't moved. He was still sitting in his chair at the edge of the room, his hands folded in his lap, watching the scene with sad, tired eyes. Carl, Lorraine said, her voice shaking, tears finally spilling over her mascara-laden lashes. She sounded broken. She sounded like a woman who had just watched her entire identity incinerate. Carl, we are family. We are Noah's parents. How could you? How could you let her do this to us? My father opened his mouth to speak. I saw the instinct in him, the lifelong instinct to apologize, to smooth things over, to be the nice guy who fixes the engine even when the customer is screaming at him. I didn't let him do it. He had apologized enough for one lifetime. I stepped in front of his line of sight, blocking Lorraine's view of him. I faced her, and for the first time that night, I let the anger I had been holding back for 10 years rise to the surface. It wasn't a hot, screaming anger. It was a cold, absolute finality. Do not you dare ask him that, I said. Do not you dare ask him that, I repeated, my voice steady and cold enough to freeze the condensation on the champagne glasses. Carl did not do this to you. Lorraine, you did this to yourselves. I turned to face the room, addressing the stunned guests as much as my in-laws. You want to know why Marlowe Ridge Partners exists? It exists because you treated the Fairview Community Credit Union like a doormat. You treated the institution where my father has banked for 40 years, the place that gave him his first car loan, the place that helped him save for my college tuition, as if it were beneath you. You borrowed their money with a smile, and then you laughed at their payment deadlines. I pointed a finger at Richard. You treated my father's signature on those guarantee documents like it was a formality for the poor. You thought because the bank manager did not wear a $3,000 suit, he would not have the guts to call in the loan. You gambled your entire house on the arrogance that you were untouchable. Richard opened his mouth to interrupt, but I cut him off. And here's the part that should keep you awake at night. The credit union wanted to foreclose 6 months ago. They were ready to seize this property before the holidays. Do you know who stopped them? Do you know who went into that branch and begged the director to give the Whitfield family one more chance? I gestured to the man sitting quietly in the corner, clutching his knees. Carl did. He asked for an extension on your behalf because he did not want to see his daughter's in-laws humiliated. He bought you 6 months of time. And what did you do with that time? Did you restructure? Did you cut costs? No. You planned a gala. You hired a string quartet while your foundation rotted. Lorraine looked at Carl, her eyes wide with shock. She had not known. Of course she had not known. It had never occurred to her that her fate might rest in the grease-stained hands of a mechanic. You speak about family, I continued, letting the memories I had suppressed for a decade bleed into my voice. But let us be clear about what that word means to you. Family means showing up when you need an audience. It means me sitting here in a cheap dress while you make jokes about my father's clothes. It means laughing at the check he wrote for our wedding, a check that represented everything he had, while you burned through cash you did not even earn. We never laughed, Richard lied, though his eyes darted away. I heard you, I snapped. I heard you in the kitchen that night. I heard you call it cute. I heard Brooke ask if we should use it to tip the valet. Brooke flinched, shrinking back into her chair. And when I started my company, I went on, the momentum carrying me forward. When I was sleeping under my desk and eating instant noodles, you called it a cute little hobby. When I signed my first contract, you ignored me to talk about tablecloths. When I hit a $200 million valuation, you went silent because my success did not fit your narrative of me as the lucky charity case. You only call me family when you need a prop for a photo op. Richard's face turned a deep, violent shade of red. He stood up, knocking his chair back. You are twisting everything. You are using your money to tear this family apart. You are vindictive. Clara, you are destroying a legacy because your feelings got hurt. I am not destroying it, I replied calmly. I am just the one turning on the lights. The cockroaches were already there. Brooke let out a huff of exasperation. She crossed her arms, rolling her eyes in a display of breathtaking ignorance. Oh my God, Clara, you are reacting so totally over the top. So what if there is some debt? Every successful business has debt. It is called leverage. Mom and Dad would have figured it out. You are just being dramatic because you want attention. I looked at her, pitying her stupidity. Brooke, this is not leverage. This is insolvency. There is nothing to figure out. The money is gone. It is not gone, Brooke shrieked. We have assets. We have the brand. Actually, a deep voice interrupted from the other side of the table. Clara is right. We all turned. Noah was standing up. He looked pale, sickly even, but he was standing straight. He looked at his parents, then at his sister, and finally at me. Noah? Lorraine whispered. Darling, tell her she is wrong. I can't, Noah said, his voice cracking. I saw the letters. Mom, I saw the notices from the credit union on Dad's desk 3 months ago. I asked him about them. I told him we needed to sell the commercial lots. I told him we needed to cancel the renovation on the patio. He turned to his father. And you told me to shut up. You told me I didn't understand high finance. You told me it was just a cash flow hiccup and that I should focus on my golf swing. Noah, sit down, Richard growled, a warning tone in his voice. No, Noah said, shaking his head. I tried to tell you. I tried to warn you that Clara wasn't who you thought she was. I told you she was brilliant. I told you she was dangerous if you crossed her, but you just kept treating her like an accessory." Noah reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at it for a second, a pained expression on his face, as if he hated what he was about to do. But then he looked at Carl, still sitting alone, still looked down upon, and his jaw hardened. "You want to know why Clara did this?" Noah asked the room. "You think she is just being mean? Listen to this. I recorded this today, at noon, in the kitchen. I left my phone on the counter when I went to the bathroom." He tapped the screen and held the phone up to the microphone that had been used for the toasts. The audio was crystal clear. The ambient noise of the kitchen filled the room, followed by the unmistakable voice of Lorraine. "God, do we really have to seat Carl at the main table tonight? He always smells like old oil and stale coffee. It ruins my appetite." Then Brooke's voice, sharp and mocking. "I know, right? And that box he's carrying around? It looks like garbage. I bet he pulled it out of a dumpster on the way here. We should just have the maid throw it out before dinner. Tell him we lost it." "We can't do that," Lorraine's voice again. "We have to play nice. Consider him a charity case we are forced to adopt. Just smile, nod at whatever boring story he tells, and make sure he doesn't touch the silk drapes with those hands." Noah stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavy, physical. It pressed down on the room like a lead blanket. The guests looked horrified. It was one thing to suspect your hosts were snobs. It was another to hear the raw, unfiltered cruelty in their own voices. Lorraine had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't deny it. It was her voice. Every person in that room recognized the cadence, the tone, the specific brand of venom. Brooke looked like she had been slapped. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "That," Noah said, his voice trembling, "is why we are here. That is how you talk about the man who raised your son's wife. That is how you talk about the man who tried to save your house." I looked at Noah. I felt a surge of gratitude. He had finally picked a side. It might have been late, maybe too late to save our marriage in the long run, but in this moment, he had stood up. I walked back to the table. I picked up the second, thinner envelope I had prepared. "This is not revenge," I said, my voice quiet again. "Revenge would be kicking you out on the street tonight. Revenge would be letting the sheriff arrive tomorrow morning to padlock the doors while the local news crews filmed it. I could do that. I have the legal right to do that." I placed the envelope on the marble table in front of Richard. "But I am not you," I said. "I do not get off on humiliation." Richard stared at the envelope. "What is this?" "It is an exit strategy," I explained. "Consider it a severance package. Inside is a transfer agreement. If you sign over full ownership of Whitfield Ridge Holdings and the estate to Marlowe Ridge Partners peacefully, without lawsuits, without dragging this out in court, I will grant you a life estate lease on a condo in the city, 2 bedrooms, paid for." I paused to let that sink in. A 2-bedroom condo, a far cry from the mansion, but a palace compared to a homeless shelter. "And," I added, "I will grant you a small monthly stipend from the company's future revenue. It is enough to live on. It is not enough to host galas. It is not enough for Bentleys, but you will not starve, and you will not be on the street." Lorraine looked at the envelope as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "However," I said, my gaze hardening, "this offer expires when I walk out that door. If you don't sign, I proceed with the foreclosure. I sell the assets for parts, and you walk away with zero. No condo, no stipend, just the debt and the shame." "You want us to give up everything?" Richard whispered. "My name? My company?" "It hasn't been your company for a long time, Richard," I said. "You have been squatting in it. I am just formalizing the reality." I leaned in closer. "And as for the name, I think I will change it. I was thinking of something stronger, something more reliable, maybe something like Harmon Ridge." I stood straight and looked at them. "The pen is in the box, right next to the tape measure you laughed at. You have 5 minutes to decide if you want to leave with dignity or if you want to be escorted out by security." I stepped back and waited. The ball was in their court, but the game was already over. I will never sign away my name, Richard roared. He did not just shout the words, he spat them. His fist came down on the marble table with such violent force that the centerpiece, a towering arrangement of white orchids and hydrangeas, toppled over. The crystal vase shattered against the stone, sending water and shards of glass skittering across the table, soaking the linen napkins and the expensive gift wrap. It was a tantrum, pure and simple, but it was also a revelation, for years. Richard had projected an image of untouchable strength, a man of steel and concrete. But in that moment, as he stood there panting, with wine stains on his cuff and panic in his eyes, the room saw the truth. His power was nothing but a thin coat of paint over a rotting structure. He was not a king defending his castle. He was a desperate man trying to shout down an avalanche. Jenna did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply adjusted her glasses and looked at him with the detached pity of a coroner examining a corpse. "That is your choice, Mr. Whitfield," Jenna said, her tone smooth and professional. "But let me explain exactly what happens if you do not pick up that pen in the next 60 seconds. She pointed to the stack of files. "If you refuse the settlement, Marlowe Ridge Partners will file the foreclosure petition with the county court at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Unlike a private transfer, a court filing is public record. It will list every single debt, every missed payment, and every lien. It will be picked up by the local business journals by noon. Your investors will pull out before lunch. The suppliers will void your contracts by the end of the day." Jenna paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. "We will seize the house within 30 days. We will liquidate the company assets via auction. And because the debts exceed the asset value, you will be left with absolutely nothing. No condo, no stipend, just a bankruptcy filing and a reputation that is radioactive." Richard stared at her, his chest heaving. He looked around the room for a lifeline, but there were none. The guests were already moving. It was a quiet, shameful exodus. The mayor had suddenly remembered an early morning meeting and was slipping out the side door. The business partners were checking their watches, avoiding eye contact, desperate to disassociate themselves from the stench of failure. The room that had been a shrine to their ego 10 minutes ago was now a collapsing stage, and the audience was walking out. "Richard," a voice whispered. It was Lorraine. She was trembling so hard the sequins on her dress shimmered like ripples on water. She reached out and gripped his forearm, her nails digging into his suit jacket. "Richard, stop," she pleaded, her voice small and broken. It was the first time I had ever heard her sound like a real person, stripped of her affectations. "We have nowhere else to go. Ironbridge won't touch us. The banks won't take our calls. If we lose this, if we lose the stipend, we will be on the street." She looked at me, terror swimming in her eyes. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She knew the girl who had built a logistics empire from a co-working space did not make empty threats. "Sign it," Lorraine begged him, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Please, before she changes her mind." Richard looked at his wife. He looked at the shattered vase on the table. He looked at the empty chairs where his friends had been sitting. The fight went out of him all at once, like a balloon punctured by a needle. His shoulders slumped. He aged 10 years in 10 seconds. He reached into the cardboard box, my father's box, and pulled out a pen. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He dragged the settlement papers toward him, the paper wet from the spilled vase water. He signed. The strokes were jerky and uneven, nothing like the flamboyant signature on the loan documents he had ignored for years. Lorraine let out a sob of relief and collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. Brooke just sat there, frozen, staring at the wall. She looked catatonic, unable to process that the legacy she bragged about on social media had just been signed away in exchange for a 2-bedroom condo and a monthly allowance. I watched them. I waited for a surge of triumph, for that feeling of victory I had imagined during those long nights eating instant noodles. But it didn't come. Instead, I just felt a deep, quiet exhaustion. I reached out and took the signed papers. I handed them to Jenna, who slipped them into her briefcase with a satisfying click. "Thank you," I said to Richard and Lorraine. My voice was soft. "I know that was hard, but thank you for facing the truth. And thank you for accepting a deal that is far more generous than anything you ever offered to the people you considered beneath you." I turned away from them. I was done. There was nothing left to say to the Whitfields. "Come on, Dad," I said. "Let us go home." Noah stepped forward. He had been standing near the window, watching the signature with a grim expression. He walked over to where my father was standing. Carl looked weary, clutching his hat in his hands. "Carl," Noah said. My father looked up, bracing himself for one last insult. "Thank you," Noah said. His voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in Clara when no one else did. And thank you for trying to save my parents, even when they didn't deserve it." Noah looked down at the table. He picked up the cardboard box. It was empty now, save for the duct tape hanging off the sides, the trash inside, the key, the photo, the tape measure, was scattered across the marble, mixed with the wreckage of the vase. Can I carry this to the car for you?" Noah asked. It was a strange request, but I knew what it meant. He was offering to carry the burden. He was offering to be of service to the man he had let his family mock for too long. "I would like that, son," Carl said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. We walked out of the dining room, leaving the Whitfields in the ruins of their anniversary party. We walked through the grand foyer, past the silent string quartet packing up their instruments, and out the heavy front doors. The night air was cool and crisp, smelling of pine and lake water. It washed over me, cleansing the scent of expensive perfume and desperation from my lungs. Behind us, I could hear the faint sounds of Lorraine sobbing and Richard shouting curses at the walls, but the sounds were muffled, fading quickly as we descended the stone steps. The wind rustled through the trees, and the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore swallowed the noise of the house completely. We reached the driveway. My old hybrid was waiting there, looking humble and reliable under the moonlight. I stopped and looked at my father. He was standing next to the car, looking back up at the house. The golden floodlights were still on, illuminating the grand facade, but to us, the house looked dark. It looked like a museum exhibit of a time that had passed. Dad looked down at his hands, those rough, scarred hands that had fixed 1,000 engines, that had carried scrap metal to buy my books, that had held a tape measure to build a life. He had walked into that house with a box of junk, and he was walking out with his dignity towering higher than their roof. "You were right, Clara," he said softly. "They didn't see it." "See what, Dad?" "The empire," he said, turning to me. "They thought the empire was the house. They thought it was the money." I smiled, tears finally prickling at the corners of my eyes. "What is the empire, Dad?" He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch rough and gentle all at once. "It is this," he said. "It is having the guts to be yourself when everyone tells you you are nothing. It is the kindness to offer a hand to the people who spit on you. It is the resilience to keep going when the tape breaks." I hugged him. I hugged him tighter than I had on my wedding day, tighter than I had when I got into college. "The only empire I ever wanted to save was the one you built in me," I whispered. Noah placed the empty cardboard box in the trunk of my car. He closed the lid with a solid thud. We got in. I started the engine. It purred to life, a quiet, efficient sound. I didn't look back at the mansion as we drove down the gravel drive. I didn't need to. I knew that back there, in the glittering room, they were sitting in the wreckage of their own making. But here, in this car, with the people who actually mattered, we had everything. The box was just cardboard, but the victory inside it was real. And as we turned onto the main road, leaving the Whitfield estate in the rearview mirror, I knew one thing for certain. The people who had looked down on that box were the only ones who had truly walked away empty-handed. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Drop a comment below and let's get a conversation started about what you would have done in Clara's shoes. If you enjoyed seeing the Whitfields get what they deserved, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share this story with even more people. Your support means the world to us.